looked at a world map and thought about how a really tiny spot could actually be a giant in global geopolitics.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
We're talking about a place that's a real strategic crossroads. Imagine this. A country where the world's military superpowers all have a foothold, and they're literally paying millions just to be there.
It really is a kind of paradox, isn't it? This small nation, a former French colony, has somehow made itself indispensable, attracting global powers while, its internal situation is, well, it's incredibly complex. And frankly, pretty hidden from view a lot of the time.
That's a perfect description. So for this deep dive, we're focusing squarely on Djibouti. We've gone through quite a few reports, some deep analyses, investigative pieces, really trying to get a handle on its unique mix of governance, economy, and importantly, foreign influence.
Right.
Our mission today really is to unpack how this small country pulls it off. How does it host so many global powers? What does that actually mean for the people living there? And what are the maybe surprising realities hiding just beneath the surface?
And what's really striking is that the whole foundation of this strategic importance, it seems to rest heavily on one person, President Ismail Omar Guelleh. He's been in charge since, 1999?
Since 1999, yeah, that's quite a long time in power. So tell us more about how he managed that. Our sources mention some pretty significant constitutional changes. What exactly happened? How did that lock in his rule?
Well, yeah, those changes came in 2010, and they basically got rid of presidential term limits, just abolished them. So that paved the way for him to run again and again. And if you look at the election results, well, the official results show him winning with 97, 98% of the vote.
Right.
Most observers, they just see that as a facade. It's really about cementing that power, not genuine electoral competition.
So, okay, if the elections are largely for show and he's effectively president for life, what does that mean for how the country is actually run? What kind of political system are we talking about here?
It gets called a one-party neo-patrimonial state, which sounds complicated, but basically...
Neo-patrimonial. What does that mean in practice?
It means power isn't just about the official government structures. It's deeply tied up with personal loyalty, family connections, clan politics. The lines between the state's resources and personal or family interests get really blurry.
Okay.
And the ruling party, the UMP Union for the presidential majority, it just dominates everything. Opposition parties, they often end up boycotting the polls, or they find it incredibly hard to even register. There's a lot of, intimidation reported.
And what about checks and balances? Things like an independent judiciary or legislature, do they exist? Do they have any teeth?
Virtually none. According to the sources we looked at, the president really holds all the cards. He controls the security forces, he appoints the judges, the senior officials, often people from his own clan or family.
Right.
So the judiciary, it's largely seen as staffed by political appointees.
Yeah.
And that leads to what sources call politically motivated prosecutions, basically very little independence.
That sounds incredibly restrictive. So what happens if someone does try to speak out? What about dissent, civil society, media? How does the regime handle criticism?
It's pretty stark, actually. There are severe limits.
Yeah.
The state owns all the main broadcast and print media. Local journalists, they face harassment. And independent online news sites, often run by people outside the country, they get routinely blocked or censored. The president himself has even publicly attacked critical media outlets.
Any specific examples?
Yeah, there's the case of La Voix de Djibouti, an exiled web station. Their journalists have reportedly been arrested or, silenced. And protests, they're either banned outright or if they happen, they're dispersed by force. Anyone openly challenging the government risks ending up arrested pretty quickly, often on what seem like trumped-up charges. It's a very, very tight grip.
Wow. Okay, but here's the fascinating part, the twist, right? This really tight internal control exists alongside this incredible openness to the outside world. This is what makes Djibouti this global crossroads. Let's start with France. That historical tie, the colonial legacy, how does that still shape things today?
It's still huge. Djibouti was a French colony, and today it hosts France's largest overseas military base in Africa. There are deep defense agreements, economic ties. France provides military aid. French companies often get preferential treatment.
And how does France view the internal politics?
Well, what's telling is that Paris has, as one source put it, generally turned a blind eye to Guelleh's repression.
Really?
Yeah. You even had President Macron welcoming Guelleh in Paris back in 2021, talking about extending the French base lease.
Yeah.
But apparently with hardly a mention of the elections or Guelleh's authoritarian track record. It seems very transactional.
It's transactional. Okay. But, and this is key, Djibouti isn't just playing France's game, is it? It's not simply a French client state. How did Gilly manage to bring in other major powers? And who else is there?
He's been incredibly savvy, or maybe aggressive, in balancing France. He actively courted other big players. So you have the United States, right? Camp Lemonnier, that's the only permanent U.S. military base in all of Africa, set up back in 2002.
Right. Crucial for counterterrorism.
Exactly. Then, in 2017, China arrives and builds its first ever overseas military base, right near the American one, actually. Plus, China's invested massively in ports, railways.
Wow. So U.S., China,
Oh.
anyone else?
Oh, yeah. Japan built its first overseas base since World War II there. Italy has a presence. Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states. It's like a who's who of global and regional powers packed onto this tiny strip of land. It's quite extraordinary.
It really is. So these bases aren't just symbolic. This is big business for Djibouti. Analysts call it a rentier state. Can you break that down? What does rentier mean here, and what kind of money are we talking about?
Rentier basically means the state gets a huge chunk of its income, not from taxing its own economy like most countries, but from renting out resources, in this case its strategic location, to foreigners. And the money is significant. We're talking tens of millions of dollars every year just from these base leases flowing directly into the government's budget. The U.S. and French bases alone, they each contribute somewhere around $15 to $18 million a year. Each. And the total from all the military rents, one estimate put it at over $125 million annually. So, yeah, the analysis that the regime depends on these foreign bases for its survival seems pretty accurate. This rent props it up.
It creates this really stark paradox then, doesn't it? There was one analyst quote, the more Djibouti has opened to the world, the more it has closed internally. What does that really tell us about Guelleh's strategy?
It tells us he's brilliantly, maybe cynically, leveraged this global competition for access. He uses the rent money and the strategic importance to solidify his own power at home, but without giving an inch on political freedoms or liberalization. The more foreigners want in, the more secure his authoritarian system becomes, in a way.
Which brings us neatly to the economic picture inside Djibouti, because it highlights this paradox perfectly. On paper, you see a GDP per capita around $3,500, which sounds, relatively decent for East Africa. But what's the reality for the average person living there?
Yeah, that GDP figure is misleading. Development is incredibly uneven. Almost all the government's revenue, something like 80 to 90%, comes from the port, and logistics basically serving as the main trade route for landlocked Ethiopia.
Right, the port is key.
Absolutely. But does that wealth trickle down? The numbers suggest not really. Over 20% of the population lives on less than $3.20 a day. Some estimates put the number living below the national poverty line as high as 70, even close to 80%.
70 to 80%? Wow, those are shocking figures. What about jobs, especially for young people? Do people feel like they're part of this economy that's supposedly built on global trade?
Officially, unemployment is around 26%. But for young people, it's thought to be much, much higher, maybe over 70% in some areas. Public services, things like health and education, they remain seriously underfunded. Yeah. And yet, the general feeling reported is that most Djiboutians are shut out from the benefits of this port economy. Wealth is very concentrated.
And that concentration, that inequality, naturally leads us to the question of corruption. Our sources paint a picture of, widespread corruption and deals happening behind closed doors. How does that actually work? And is it possible to follow the money, like the money from the base leases or foreign aid?
It's incredibly difficult. That's one of the main findings. The government just doesn't publish detailed budgets regularly. Audit reports are rare. So tracking where that significant income from base rents or aid actually ends up is, it's almost impossible for outsiders and probably for most citizens too.
So fertile ground for cronyism.
Exactly. There are widespread allegations of cronyism, especially when it comes to big infrastructure projects. The most famous example is probably the Dorali container terminal. The government essentially kicked out Dubai's DP World, allegedly favoring Chinese interests, and then just ignored international arbitration rulings that awarded DP World millions in damages.
Just ignored them. That's bold.
It shows a certain impunity, perhaps linked to that strategic importance we talked about.
And who's allegedly benefiting from all this? Is it connected to the top?
The sources strongly suggest yes. The Goulet family and their inner circle are alleged to control key parts of the economy. Corruption is described as widespread, particularly at the highest levels of business and politics. There are even hints in the Pandora Papers about offshore accounts linked to Djibouti's elite, although tracing President Gully's personal wealth remains very difficult. It's opaque.
Okay, so bringing this all together, the big question seems to be about the price of the stability that Djibouti offers, and maybe the complicity of the foreign powers who benefit from it. Why do these countries, especially Western nations with military bases there, seem to tolerate Gullah's authoritarianism?
Well, the argument you hear consistently from analysts is pure realpolitik. Foreign powers, they tolerate Gullah's authoritarianism because he delivers regional stability and unimpeded access.
So it's strategic convenience over democratic value.
Pretty much. For the U.S. and its allies, Djibouti is absolutely vital for counterterrorism, anti-piracy efforts in a really volatile region, the Horn of Africa, Yemen nearby. For China, it's a key node on their Belt and Road Initiative securing trade routes. So Gullah provides something they all need, reliable access.
And the implication is that the rent money they pay, the money that props up the state, effectively subsidizes the dictatorship, as some put it. Are there specific examples of foreign governments kind of looking the other way?
Yes, quite clearly. That Brussels Times piece mentioned how France's overlooking of the democratic deficit was obvious, with French presidents essentially buttering up Gullah.
Buttering up.
Right.
Strong words.
Yeah. And even the U.S., sources suggest, quietly funded Gullah's campaign through lobbyists and sent congratulatory notes after elections rather than publicly criticizing the human rights situation. It points to a definite choice being made. Strategy first.
It definitely seems like a system where external stability is bought, perhaps, at the cost of internal freedom and accountability. Which raises that difficult question again. Are these international military patrons, by providing the funds that keep the regime afloat, implicitly complicit in underwriting Gullah's role, even if they remain silent on the repression?
It's a very uncomfortable question, isn't it? But based on the evidence of financial support and diplomatic silence, it's hard to avoid asking it.
And meanwhile, for anyone inside Djibouti who tries to challenge the system, what happens? Is there any meaningful opposition left?
Meaningful and effective opposition. Virtually none, according to the reports. The last election that felt even vaguely competitive was way back in 2005.
Wow.
Any kind of activism is extremely high risk. Protests need government permission, which is rarely given, and if they happen anyway, they face violence. We saw that back in 2011, during the sort of Arab Spring-inspired protests, police reportedly killed demonstrators, opposition leaders were jailed. And again in 2020, protests about corruption were met with force.
It sounds like a zero-tolerance policy for dissent. Are there specific cases of individuals being targeted that stand out?
There are several. There's Abdurrahman Bora, who was a prominent businessman turned opposition figure. He was convicted of terrorism charges back home in absentia. But crucially, UK courts later threw out those charges, calling them politically motivated, essentially fabricated.
Fabricated, okay.
And then there's the really troubling case of Lieutenant Fuad Yusuf Ali. He was an Air Force pilot who became a whistleblower, exposing alleged corruption within the military. He was arrested, reportedly tortured, and charged with treason. There were actually nationwide protests supporting him, but again, they were violently put down.
So the message is clear. Don't speak out. The few who do either have to flee the country and operate online, maybe anonymously, or they face severe consequences. The local press is effectively muzzled. It sounds like the regime maintains control through a mix of fear and doling out patronage to loyalists.
That seems to be the assessment, yes. But, it's important to add a caveat here.
Right, because getting a completely clear picture of Djibouti isn't easy, is it? You mentioned the lack of transparency earlier. What are the main gaps or contradictions in the information we have?
Yeah, understanding Djibouti fully is definitely a challenge. The government's opacity is key. Because they don't publish detailed budgets or anti-corruption audits, it's really hard to independently verify their economic claims or track that money flow we discussed.
So specific numbers are hard to pin down.
Exactly. Getting solid, comprehensive data on, say, the Gullah family's actual wealth or the precise up-to-date figures for all the military base rents, it's difficult. And proving direct foreign complicity in repression that's usually inferred from their actions and their silence, rather than found in like a leaked document saying, let's ignore the human rights issues, it's more about observing the pattern.
So what we're left with is this image, this facade of stability, this helpful ally, but underneath there's deep political repression, stark inequality, and the label peaceful partner kind of obscures the real human cost of this foreign patronage. We end up relying heavily on these piecemeal investigative reports, NGO findings, to try and glimpse that hidden reality.
So wrapping this up, what's the main takeaway here? What does it all mean?
I think, in summary, Djibouti presents this powerful paradox. It's a country whose vital geostrategic location has basically secured its government through foreign rent money. This creates an appearance of stability, which is valuable to global powers. But that stability comes at a steep internal price. Widespread poverty for many, profound inequality, and severe political repression for anyone who steps out of line. The very factors that make it important internationally seem to enable the hardship domestically.
Which leaves us, and maybe you listening, with a really provocative thought to chew on. As the world seems to rely more and more on these strategic footholds, these stable partners in unstable regions, how much is too much? When does overlooking human rights abuses for the sake of perceived stability cross a line? What does Djibouti's story really tell us about the true cost, the hidden price tag of these global strategic partnerships?